The cold at Relay Station Kestrel did not arrive. It was simply there, the way the mountain was there, older than any of us and indifferent to whether we lived. I had been at the station 4 months when they sent her up, and in 4 months I had learned the one true thing about that altitude. It took from you slowly, without malice, and it did not give back. 14,000 feet strips a man down to what he actually is. I had watched big men, loud men, men who benched twice my weight in the flatland gyms, come off the trucks at the lower camp swaggering, and be reduced within a week to gray-faced things that sat on their cots breathing like it was work. The mountain did not care what you had been. It only asked what you could still do when your body was drowning on dry land. I ran the radios. That was my war, a headset, a diesel generator that I nursed like a sick animal, and a bank of equipment in a stone and timber hut that the wind found every seam of. Corporal Dan Ray's signals. I was not a mountain man. I was a lowland kid from a river town who had tested well and been handed a trade, and I had made my peace with being the least impressive man on a peak full of hard ones. My job was to keep the voices moving. Everything else on that ridge belonged to the platoon, and the platoon belonged to Sergeant Cole Brunner. Brunner was the mountain made into a man. 10 years at altitude, lungs like a bellows, a face gone to leather, and a way of looking at you that measured exactly how much weight you could carry, and then subtracted a little for spite. He was not cruel the way weak men are cruel. He was cruel the way the cold was, as a kind of honesty. He believed the mountain sorted people into those who belonged and those who would get someone killed, and he believed it was his job to find out which you were before the mountain did it for him at a worse time. So when the resupply truck ground up the switchbacks that morning, and a single new soldier climbed down with a rucksack and a rifle case, and stood there taking slow, deliberate breaths, I already knew how it would go. I knew because I had watched it go that way a dozen times. She was not big. That was the first thing the platoon saw, and the only thing most of them bothered to see. Medium height, wiry, dark hair cut short under her cap, a stillness to her that read to those men as either calm or weakness depending on what they wanted it to mean. She had the rifle case slung and a rucksack that looked heavy, and she came off that truck at 14,000 feet and did not gasp, did not stagger, did not do the thing every new arrival does where the thin air hits them like a hand on the chest and their eyes go wide. She just breathed slow, low, in through the nose, a rhythm, and looked up at the ridge line above the hut the way you'd look at a job. I clocked that. I didn't understand it yet, but I clocked it. Most people arriving at that height are too busy suffering to look at anything. "Private," Brunner said, reading the transfer slip a runner had brought him. He did not look up from it. "Says here you're a replacement marksman. Says here you came off a mountain warfare billet." He let the paper drop to his side, and now he did look at her, and the whole platoon drifted in to watch, because Brunner putting a new arrival through the ringer was the best entertainment Kestrel offered. "You don't look like you've spent much time up high." "I've spent some, Sergeant," she said. Her voice was even, not soft, not hard, even. "Some?" He smiled without any warmth in it. "See, that's the thing about some. The mountain doesn't grade on some. You want to know how I can tell you're going to be a problem?" "I'd like to know what you think, Sergeant." A couple of the men laughed at that, at the flatness of it, the way it didn't flinch, which they read as her not understanding the danger she was in. Corporal Vance, Brunner's second, the kind of man who laughs a half-second after his sergeant to make sure the sergeant hears it, laughed loudest. "You came off that truck breathing like you're trying not to throw up," Brunner said. "Slow and careful. That's a person managing altitude sickness. That's a person whose body is fighting the height and losing. Up here we call that being altitude sick, and up here that gets a man killed because when it hits the fan I need soldiers who can run, not soldiers who have to stop and remember how to breathe." He looked her over one more time. "You're going to wash out, Private. I've seen it 100 times. I just hope you do it before you cost me somebody." She didn't argue. That was the thing that stayed with me later when I understood. She didn't argue, didn't puff up, didn't rattle off a record. She just took another one of those slow, low breaths, and I realized watching her that she wasn't fighting the altitude at all. That controlled breathing wasn't sickness. It was the opposite. It was a person who had learned, somewhere over a long time, exactly how to feed a body on thin air. She was packing her oxygen the way a diver paces a tank. Brunner had looked at the most acclimatized soldier on that ridge and called her sick, because she was the only one disciplined enough not to gasp. But I was signals. Nobody asked me. "What do we even call you?" Vance said, grinning, playing to the crowd. "You mountain warfare types always have a call sign, right? Something scary." He said it the way you'd ask a child to do a trick. "Go on, do the voice. Come on, what's your call sign, Private? Let's hear something that'll frighten the enemy." The men laughed again, ready for her to either have nothing or to say something they could mock for a week. She looked at Vance for a moment. Then she looked, briefly, up at the ridge line again, that same job-appraising look, and back. "You don't need it," she said. "Call signs are for the radio. If you're hearing mine, it means something's already gone wrong." And she picked up her rucksack and her rifle case and walked toward the barracks hut to stow her gear, leaving them with nothing to laugh at, which is the one thing a crowd like that cannot forgive. Her name was Private Wren Havorson. I logged her into the station manifest that afternoon, and I remember thinking the name didn't match the stillness. Wren, a small brown bird. I had no idea yet. The thing you have to understand about that ridge is that it was not a place. It was a set of conditions that changed by the hour, and staying alive meant reading them, and almost nobody at Kestrel could actually read them. They could survive them, which is different. Brunner and his men could endure the cold, haul the loads, hold the line. But reading the mountain, knowing before it happened when the wind would swing and drop the temperature 20 degrees, when the snow on the north face had gone from packed to hollow, when a clear sky was lying to you, that was a separate skill, and it was rarer than any of them wanted to admit. I watched Havorson learn our ridge in 3 days the way I'd learned it in 3 months, and mostly I watched her do it in silence, because nobody was talking to her. She was frozen out in the small ways men use to tell someone they don't count. Not hazed. Brunner wouldn't have allowed hazing. He had his own hard code just erased. Meals eaten alone. Work details handed to her without a word and taken back without thanks. Vance had started calling her Sick as a nickname, and it had caught, the way an ugly thing catches when a crowd is bored. "Hey, Sick, move the fuel cans. Sick, you're on latrine detail." She answered to it without expression, did the work, and went back to the one thing she did that nobody understood. She read the mountain. I'd see her at the edge of the outcrop in the gray hour before dawn, not exercising, not on watch, just standing with a cheap thermometer and a strip of surveyor's tape she'd tied to a pole, watching the tape move. She'd hold a hand up against the sky and sight the ridge line and the far pass through it. She kept a small waterproof notebook, and she wrote in it numbers, times, little sketches of the cloud. Once I passed close enough to see a page, and it was covered in a kind of shorthand. Wind bearings, temperatures, a rough profile of the north face with arrows on it and the word hollow underlined twice. "What's hollow?" I asked her. It was the first thing I'd said to her that wasn't station business. We were the two people at Kestrel that nobody talked to, me because I was just the radio, her because she was sick, and maybe that's why she answered me straight. "The snowpack on the north approach to the pass," she said, not looking up from the tape. "The sun's been hitting at midday and the cold's been locking it at night. You get a hard crust over a weak layer. Looks solid. It isn't. Put enough weight moving across it at the wrong angle and the whole slab goes." She nodded up at the pass. The high notch in the ridge that was the only ground route to the units on the far side. If anybody has to cross that pass, they want to go single file, spread out, before the sun's been on it 2 hours. Not in a bunched column in the afternoon. In the afternoon that slope is a loaded gun. You tell Brunner that. For the first time she smiled, a small tired thing. Sick doesn't tell the sergeant about snow, Corporal. Sick moves the fuel cans. I should have said something then. I want to tell you I did. But I was the radio and Brunner was the mountain, and I had 4 months of learning to keep my head down, and so I logged it in my own memory and said nothing. That's the part I carry. She wrote hollow in her notebook on a Tuesday. On Thursday, the order came down over my radios that changed everything, and I was the one who took it. And I heard the whole thing go wrong in real time with a headset pressed to my ear. Battalion wanted a company moved. That was the shape of it, stripped of the code and the formality. A full company, better than 200 men, was to cross from the far valley over our pass to the near side, part of some larger repositioning that made sense on a map at sea level and no sense at all to anyone standing on the actual ground at 14,000 feet. They'd come up the far approach, transit the pass, and stage through Kestrel before dropping to the lower camp. I copied the movement order and carried the printout to Brunner myself, and I was standing there in his hut when Halvorsen, who had been hauling a fuel can past the open door, stopped. She didn't come in. She just stopped in the doorway with the can still in her hand and said, "When are they crossing the pass, Sergeant?" Brunner didn't look up. "That's not your concern, Private. When they cross matters more than almost anything else about this, Sergeant." Her voice was still even, but there was something underneath it now, something pressed flat by will. "If they're coming up the far approach, they'll hit the pass in the afternoon. The north slope's gone hollow, a bunched column on that slope after midday." "Private," Brunner set down his pen, "I have crossed that pass in every condition this mountain has. I have forgotten more about this ridge than you've seen, and I am not going to plan a company movement around a nervous replacement with a piece of tape on a stick." He said it without heat, which was worse than heat. "Go move your fuel cans." She stood there one more second. I watched her decide something, watched her weigh saying more against what it would cost, and watched her conclude it wouldn't matter. Then she said quietly, "At least tell them single file, spread out. That much won't cost you anything. Get out of my hut, Private." She went, and Brunner, to his small credit because he was hard, not stupid, did key my radio a while later and pass a note down to the crossing company. "Advise caution north slope of pass, possible unstable snow." But he passed it as a caution, a footnote, the kind of thing that gets read out and nodded at and forgotten, not as what Halvorsen had meant it to be, which was change the plan. And a company on a schedule, cold and tired and wanting the transit over with, does not spread into single file across 2 hours of slope, because a relay station passed a footnote about caution. They came up the far approach through the morning. I tracked them by their radio checks, little bursts of a lieutenant's voice growing closer, and I could hear in the background of his transmissions the sound of a lot of men and a lot of load moving as a body. By early afternoon they were at the base of the north slope, and the sun had been on that snow for 3 hours, and they were bunched, because they were tired and it was cold and single file doubles the time you spend exposed. I heard it happen. That's the thing I can't unhear. I had the lieutenant on the net mid-sentence giving me a position update and then his voice changed. Not a scream. Worse than a scream. A sudden flat urgency, the voice of a man watching the ground itself decide to move. He said, "Stand by." And then there was a sound behind his words that I felt in my chest more than heard, a low, enormous exhale of the mountain. And then the transmission broke into shouting and wind, and the particular chaos of men trying not to be buried. The north slope had gone, exactly where she'd underlined it twice. It was not a total burial. That's the only mercy in it. The slab released above the main body of the company rather than under them, and it took the front element and the trail and the trucks, but the bulk of the men were driven by the roar and the instinct that older mountain hands have off the slope and up onto a spine of exposed rock on the near side of the pass. A rib of stone, wind-scoured, maybe 200 yards long, the one place on that slope the snow couldn't lie. That was the good news. The bad news was everything else. 212 men, by the count we assembled through the afternoon, were alive on that rock spine. They were on the wrong side of the pass. The avalanche had wiped the route behind them and buried the trucks with the heavy gear, the extra fuel, the cold weather reserve. They had what was on their backs and no way forward that didn't cross more loaded slope, and no way back at all. And above all of it, coming in fast off the far peaks the way she'd been tracking on her tape for a week, was weather. I had it on the net within the hour, relayed from the lower camp's Met station, and it was the number every soul on that mountain feared. A front closing in, temperatures falling through the night toward a killing cold, and a ceiling coming down that would ground every aircraft in the region. No helicopters, not that night. 212 men on an exposed rock at 14,000 feet, no shelter, no reserve, a storm coming, and the temperature already starting its long slide down toward the number where a stranded man simply stops. Command's answer, relayed through me over the next 2 hours, amounted to hold on. A relief column was being assembled at the lower camp and would push up in the morning when the weather broke. Morning. I did the arithmetic that everyone on the net was doing and not saying. Those men would not have a morning. Not exposed, not at that temperature, not without shelter or fire or reserve. The cold would take them through the night, quietly, the way it took everything on that mountain, and the relief column would climb up in the clear dawn to a rock spine full of the dead. Brunner knew it too. I have to give him this. When he understood, he did not bluster. He stood in my hut with the traffic coming in and his leather face went still and gray, and I watched a hard man do the hardest arithmetic there is, and I watched him arrive at the answer that there was nothing his platoon could do. To reach the stranded company, we'd have to cross the pass ourselves, the same slope, more loaded now, in falling light with the storm coming. Sending his men across, it would just add their bodies to the count. He knew it. It was killing him, but he knew it. There's no route, he said to no one, to the radio to the mountain. There's no route that doesn't cross the slide path, not in the dark, not in this. There's one, a voice said from the doorway. Halvorsen. She had her rifle case in one hand and her rucksack on and her notebook open in the other, and she was not asking. She stepped into the light of my hut and laid the notebook on the table over Brunner's map, and I saw that the shorthand I hadn't understood was a week of the mountain, written down, wind bearings, temperatures by the hour. The profile of every slope around that pass with the hollow one marked, and this is the part that stopped Brunner cold. A second route drawn in, a thin line traversing not the open slope but a series of rock ribs and a couloir on the eastern shoulder, ground too steep and broken to hold a slab, ground that a person who could read it could move on when the open slope was death. This goes, she said, tracing it. It's not a route for a company. It's a route for one person moving light and right tonight to reach that spine and hold the choke point at the top of the couloir so I can bring them down at one at a time before the storm closes it. The open pass is gone until the cold locks the pack again. That's near dawn, and dawn's too late for them. But the east couloir will go now, for someone who knows how to move on it. I can get to them. I can get them onto ground that holds. And I can cover the couloir mouth while they come down, because when 200 cold men start moving in the dark on steep ground, something always comes apart, and somebody has to be the still point they move past. Brunner stared at the line on the map, and then at her. And I watched 10 years of certainty about who this small, quiet person was start to come apart in his face. One person can't hold a route for 200 men through a storm, he said, but it wasn't a refusal anymore. It was a man asking to be told he was wrong. One person is what you have, she said, and it's what the ground allows. More than one on that couloir in the dark and you'll lose them off it. She closed the notebook. Sergeant, you told me I was going to cost you somebody. I'm asking you to let me be the one who doesn't. There was a silence in that hut that I have never forgotten, full of the diesel hum and the first hard grains of the storm starting to tick against the window. Who are you? Brunner said quietly, not the challenge from the truck, a real question. She was already shouldering her pack. Right now, she said, I'm the person who can reach them, The rest doesn't matter until they're down. She went out into the failing light with a load stripped to nothing but what the ground required. Rope, the rifle, ammunition, a headlamp she wouldn't use until she had to, and a small radio that I gave her myself, that I set to a working channel and pressed into her hand in the doorway. "When I hear yours," I said, trying to make a joke of it and failing, "it means something's gone wrong, right?" She looked at me. For a second the stillness broke and I saw what was underneath it, which was not calm at all. It was a person about to spend a night doing something almost no one alive could do, and knowing exactly how thin the margin was. "When you hear mine, Corporal," she said, "it means I'm working. Keep the net clear for me." And then, because I think she knew I was the one man on that ridge who'd listened, "Snow Widow, that's the call sign. Log it. If tonight goes the way it might, somebody should have written it down." She fixed her headlamp strap, looked once up at the couloir on the eastern shoulder, gray and near vertical and vanishing into the incoming cloud. That same job-appraising look she'd given the ridge from the truck on her first morning. And she went up into it, and the mountain took her out of sight. I put the name in my log, Snow Widow, 1710 hours. Then I sat down at my radios for the longest night of my life, and I did the one thing I could do, which was keep the net clear and listen. The next hours I know better than I know most of my own life, because I lived them through a headset in the dark. She reached the spine. I know because at 1852 my radio crackled and her even voice came through, low and steady over the rising wind. "Kestrel, Widow, I'm on the rock with them. Company's cold but intact. Starting them down the East Couloir single file. Keep the net clear. No drama in it. A person reporting work." And then she held. I cannot tell you everything that happened on that couloir because I only heard the edges of it, but I can tell you the shape. 212 exhausted, freezing men had to be brought down a near-vertical chute of rock and snow, in the dark, in a rising storm, one at a time, past a single point where the ground was worst, and at that point the choke, she planted herself. Every man who came down past her. I heard it in the traffic that leaked through, her voice, over and over through the night, flat and certain, feeding them past the danger. Slow, left hand to the rock. Wait for my word. Move. Next. She had made herself the still point, exactly as she'd said, and 200 frightened men in the dark moved past that still point because it did not move. Twice something came apart the way she'd known it would. Once a man near the top slipped and started a slide of loose men and snow, and I heard her voice cut through the net. Hold, brace, and heard it not become a disaster, heard her talk it still. And once, near the worst of the storm, there was a sound over her open mic that I did not understand at first, a series of flat, spaced cracks, and I realized she was shooting. Later I learned the far lip of the couloir had a stretch of overhung cornice that the wind was loading, a second slab building over the men as they descended, and that she had done the one thing almost no one could have done, read it building in the dark, ranged it, and brought it down early with precise fire into the trigger point, dropping the cornice in a controlled slide off the far side before it could load enough to release across the descending column. Methodical, set up by a week of watching the sky, not luck. The opposite of luck. She held that choke point for 11 hours. Through the coldest part of the night, when the temperature bottomed out at the number I'd feared, and the storm was at its worst, and men came down past her half frozen, and she got them moving again with nothing but her voice and her certainty. She did not come off the rock. Every time the net cleared enough for the lower camp to ask her status, the answer was the same 3 words in that same even voice: still working. Next. And one by one, then in a thin, steady line, the men came down the couloir onto ground that held, and were gathered and moved and warmed at the base, and the count that came up to me over the night climbed the right direction instead of the wrong one. 60. Then 100. Then, gray hours later, with the storm beginning to tear apart and the first bad light coming into the east, the number reached the one I'd been praying toward. 212. All of them, every man off that rock and down the couloir and alive. Cold hurt, some of them badly, but alive, alive to a man, when the arithmetic of that afternoon had said none of them would see the morning. Here is the part I did not know until it was over, the part that came up to me later in pieces, from a battalion clerk and a med officer, and finally from the one clean line in her file. Wren Halvorsen was not a replacement rookie. She was one of a handful of mountain warfare specialists. The whole command had a high-altitude marksman and route specialist with more time on hard ground above the tree line than Brunner's entire platoon combined. The controlled breathing he'd called altitude sickness was the acclimatization discipline of someone who had spent years learning to work a body on thin air. She had been sent to Kestrel not because she'd washed out, but because, months before, on a different mountain, she had disobeyed a hold-in-place order to go bring back a cut-off patrol that command had already written off, and she'd brought them back alive, and been brought before a board for the disobedience, and been quietly reassigned to a relay station's platoon while it sorted out, her record flagged, her call sign filed away. She had done it once before, gone up alone against the order because the arithmetic said the men would die otherwise. It had cost her a board and her billet and her good name, and it had turned her into sick, the rookie they were sure would wash out. And when the mountain did it again, when there were men on a rock and a storm coming and command saying hold on until morning, she had looked at the same arithmetic and made the same choice, knowing exactly what it had cost her the last time. Snow Widow, the call sign they'd asked for as a joke, do the voice, say something scary, and she'd told them the truth and they hadn't heard it. If you're hearing mine, it means something's already gone wrong. Something had gone wrong, and they'd heard it, and it had held the ridge. She came down the couloir last. Of course she did. When the final man was off the rock, she brought herself down the chute in the gray dawn light, and she walked into the base at the lower camp on her own feet, rimed white with frost, her hands wrecked from 11 hours on cold rock and colder rifle, moving slow, that same slow, low, disciplined breathing, the thing Brunner had looked at and called weakness. The relief column had climbed up in the clear dawn expecting to recover the dead. Instead, they met a company coming down alive. And they'd heard, over the net, through the night, most of what had happened. The whole mountain had heard it, the even voice holding the choke point hour after hour, so that by the time she walked into the base, the men there knew what they were looking at. Brunner was there. He'd come down through the night with his platoon along the newly locked pass to help move the rescued men, and he was standing at the edge of the base when she came in, and I was there too, because when the storm broke I'd left the hut to a relief operator and come down to see with my own eyes the thing I'd only heard. She stopped in front of Brunner. She didn't say anything. She didn't have anything to prove, and she knew it, and more to the point, she was too spent to perform even if she'd wanted to, which she never had. And Sergeant Cole Brunner, 10 years on the mountain, the hardest man I ever served under. The man who'd looked at the most capable soldier on that ridge and called her sick, came to attention in front of a frost-white private he'd nicknamed after a sickness, and he saluted her. "Snow Widow," he said. He said the call sign the way you say a thing you've earned the right to say, and no more than that, clean, correct, no joke left anywhere in it. I had it wrong. From the truck I had all of it wrong. His voice was not quite steady. 212. You brought down 212 off that rock while I stood in a hut and told a radio there was no route. He held the salute. There's not a thing I can say that's the size of it, so I'll just say the name right. Snow Widow. And around him, one by one and then all together, the platoon that had called her sick, and the rescued company that owed her every one of their mornings, and the relief column that had climbed up ready to carry bodies. They came to attention on that cold ground, and they held it, silent in the gray light, 200 men and more standing in salute to one small, still person swaying on her feet with frost in her hair. She looked at Brunner for a moment, and then she did the only thing that was hers to do. She brought her ruined right hand up, slow, steady, disciplined to the last, and she returned the salute. "Next time," she said, and her even voice barely carried, but in that silence it didn't have to, "spread them out on the slope, Sergeant. Single file. Before the sun's on it 2 hours. Single file, Brunner said. Before the sun, yes, I'll remember. A board sat weeks later on the matter of a private who had disobeyed a hold order to cross a closed pass in a storm. I gave my statement to it, the whole thing, the tape on the stick, hollow underlined twice, the route she'd drawn while Brunner said there was none, the 11 hours, the 212. So did Brunner, and I have never seen a man submit himself so completely to being wrong on the record. The board restored her billet and her name, and quietly, her flagged record was cleared. She never once spoke of it to me as vindication. To her, it had never been about the record. It had been about the arithmetic and the men, and the choice you make when the two of them line up the only way they can. I stayed a signals corporal. I never became a mountain man, but I came off that peak a different one than the Rivertown kid who'd gone up it, and the difference was her. I had spent 4 months learning to keep my head down, to be the least man on a ridge of hard ones, to let the mountain and the Brunners of the world do the sorting and stay quiet in my hut with my voices. And I had stood in a doorway and heard a small even voice say, at least tell them single file, that much won't cost you anything, and I had said nothing, because she was sick and I was the radio and it wasn't my place. That silence is mine. I'll carry it as long as I carry anything. But I also logged a name in the dark at 1710 hours on the worst night of my life, because she asked me to, because somebody should have written it down, and then I sat at my radios and heard that name hold a mountain. And when the board wanted the truth, I stood up and gave it, all of it, and did not keep my head down, because I had finally learned the thing she'd known from the first slow breath she took off that truck, that the mountain does not care what you have been, only what you can still do when everything is against you, and that the smallest, stillest person on the ridge is sometimes the only one strong enough to go up into the dark alone and bring the rest of us home. They asked her for something scary that first morning to laugh at. She gave them her name at the end of the world, and 212 men lived to hear it, and every one of us who was there stood up and said it right. Snow Widow. I wrote it down.